Thousands of years ago, the Earth experienced an ice age. During this time of massive coldness, lots of water froze to create glaciers. As these glaciers froze, they took water out of the ocean. The ocean levels went down to such an extent that land that had previously been covered by the water appeared. In regards to North America, this land became known as the Bering Land Bridge that stretched between Asia and North America, between present day Russia and Alaska. Over the years, over thousands of years, animals migrated across the land bridge. As they migrated, starting around 36,000 BC, nomadic people, who are people who move from place to place, followed these animals. So, over the thousands of years, as the animals moved across the land bridge from Asia to North America and then down North America, these nomadic groups followed them. Around 10,000 BC, the climate began to warm, the ice melted, the ocean levels rose, and these nomadic people were now cut off and in America. This is where the most ancient people in America originated. The first of these people to reach Texas arrived around 11,000 BC. From then until 1528 AD, they were the only people in Texas. How these early nomadic groups found food, they worked as what were known as hunter-gatherers. Their way of life involved them moving from place to place, following the animals. The men mostly served as the hunters. They hunted mammoth and giant bison. Then, as those animals died out, they hunted smaller bison, deer, rabbits, and birds. They also gathered food too. In each of these regions, or the areas that they would live in the seasons, depending on where the animals went, they would gather nuts, berries, prickly pear fruit, plums, grapes, and other wild food crops that grew in those regions to supplement their diet. For finding shelter, the earliest Texans lived in natural caves. Over time, around 600 AD to 700 AD, new technologies were developed by these nomadic groups. Specifically, the bow and arrow is one of the first ones. This makes hunting easier. It makes it easier for one person to bring down larger game. Then you start to see the invention of pottery. Pottery allows them to cook and store food. It gives things like nuts and stuff you could keep safe from small animals such as mice that might eat it if it was in a wicker or grass basket. And then from there, the next major milestone occurred around 1200 AD when we see the development of agriculture in Texas, where these nomadic people started intentionally growing their own crops. This allowed for people to settle and live in one area. As a result, now that people are settling and living in one area, we start to get distinct groups and cultures of native peoples in Texas. Of these native peoples' cultures, we see one group we're going to look at first are the Southeastern and Gulf cultures. There were similarities among all of the Native American groups in Texas. They lived in small groups called bands. Their spiritual beliefs also followed similar patterns. Natural events were seen as the result of spirits. Spirits were seen to walk the earth and interact with people. And then shamans were the people who these groups believed to have the power to summon spirits to heal the sick. Also, a similarity was that all the groups believed that people, plants, and animals all once understood each other. There were differences between the groups, though. Each group had its own culture, they spoke their own languages, they organized their bands differently. And the geography of Texas is going to shape these differences on how each group is going to live. Of the people of the Southeastern and Gulf Coast, the first group we need to know are the Caddo. They included more than 20 different groups, make up the larger Caddo group of Native Americans. They lived along the Red River and in East Texas. They were part of a loosely structured confederation. So each group was independent, but they interacted with each other. These groups were connected by kinship ties and a shared ancestry. One thing unique about the Caddo was it was a matrilineal society, that kinship was traced through mothers, where in Europe it was a patrilineal society where kinship was traced through the fathers. The Caddo were an agricultural society. Their main crop was corn. They had a very large trade network going all the way from the Great Lakes in the north to the Gulf of Mexico, and then from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Appalachian Mountains in the east. The Caddo were known for their pottery, and they stayed in East Texas until 1859 when they were forced to relocate to a reservation in Oklahoma by the United States government. Another group in the southeast and Gulf Coast were the Karankawa. Uh, that name is used for different Native American groups along the Texas Gulf Coast. So there are several different groups that fall under the Karankawa heading. The Karankawa were nomadic. Hunting and fishing were their main food sources, their main activities. They were also gatherers. They used very large canoes as they moved along the coast. One canoe held an entire family. In 1528, the Karankawa were the first Native Americans in Texas to meet Europeans when they came into contact with Cabeza de Vaca. By the 1800s, though, the Karankawa had all died out in Texas because of European diseases that they did not have immunities to. Another group were the Texans. They lived on the South Texas plains. They were also nomadic, using bows and arrows to hunt deer and small animals. They gathered prickly pear, nuts, and mesquite beans. And like with the Karankawa, by 1800s, the Texans had died out from disease or had moved to Mexico. The final group in this area were the Attakappans. These were also hunter-gatherers. They lived in the bayous and swamps of southeast Texas, and they were known as alligator hunters. In the west, you have the Pueblo culture. The Pueblo culture lived in settled villages. Their homes were made from adobe bricks. These are bricks made from mud that are dried in the sun. There were two main groups that made up the Puebloan culture in Texas. The Jornada were one of these groups. They date back to ancient times in southwest Texas. They built pit houses that were partially underground to give them relief from the heat in West Texas, specifically in the El Paso area. Around the Chihuahuan Desert is where they lived. They grew beans, corn, and squash. One of the places they lived was near Juco Tanks, near El Paso, which is a historic site today. And around 1400 AD, the Jornada disappeared. We're not sure what happened to them. The other group in Texas of the Puebloan culture, the Tigua. The Tigua moved from New Mexico to El Paso around 1600. They named their new home Isleta del Sur, and many of them still live there today on a reservation. Isleta is one of the oldest continuous settlements in Texas. It is a National Historic Site. All adult males in the Tigua group could vote on members of the tribal council, and then the council elected its leaders. They had a religious leader and a governor who was the political leader. There's also, in the central part of Texas and in the northern part, you had Native Americans who were part of the Plains culture. The Plains culture were a nomadic culture who followed the bison herds. Their life was built around the bison. It was used for food. The hides were used for clothes, for teepees, for houses. They made tools out of the bones. That the entire Plains Indian culture was built around the bison. One of the groups who are in the Plains Native American group in Texas are the Humano. They split their time between the Plains and Puebloan cultures. They lived by trading. They would hunt the bison, but they would also trade with the other groups, with Puebloans in the west and with other Plains Native Americans in the east. They served as the middlemen between these eastern farming groups and the Puebloans of New Mexico. They used a distinct stripe markings on their face to distinguish themselves, and the Humano in the 1500s and 1600s are going to be driven out of Texas as the Apache moved into the plains. Another Plains Native American group in Texas are the Tonkawa. They lived in teepee villages throughout the southern plains. They also were nomadic hunters. They fought with the other groups regularly. Only about 1,500 people survived in the Tonkawa group when they first met Europeans in the 1600s. Many of them had died out quickly due to disease and fighting, which is one of the themes you see with the impact of European diseases on Native Americans, that in the 1600s, by the time Europeans came into contact with the Tonkawa had already been exposed to these diseases and devastated by them for decades without ever actually having had contact with Europeans yet. A fourth major plains group in Texas were the Apache. The Apache came from the far north of the United States and migrated down the Rocky Mountains. They settled in the Southwest, specifically in Texas, western Texas, and through Arizona, into Arizona. And they're going to be one of the dominant groups, the major groups in that area. There were two main Apache groups in Texas. There was the Mescalero Apache in West Texas and the Lipan Apache in Central Texas. They relied on bison for food. They were one of the first Native American groups to use horses. And as the way the Lipan drove out the Hamano, but they then were driven out by the Comanche. And so this conflict and turnover continues. The Comanche then, having driven out the Lipan Apache, moved into West Texas in the early 1700s. They lived in West Texas till the late 1800s. They used horses to become excellent hunters, specifically of bison. The Comanche were divided into bands, with each one having its own leaders. The Comanche were very hostile, fought other groups. They also fought American settlers. They were one of the last groups in West Texas that continued to resist later immigration by Americans and by Europeans into the region. They were finally, in the late 1800s, forced onto reservations in Oklahoma. And then there were the Kiowa. These were nomadic horsemen. They were known for having the largest horse herds on the plain. With the loss of the bison herds in the 1870s, this is also going to force the Kiowa onto reservations. For hundreds of years, these Native American groups were the only people in Texas until the arrival of Spanish explorers in the 1500s would dramatically change both the cultures of the Native Americans, but also the history of Texas.